Welcome to the last and final day of the Greening Our Cities series. Today, we're going to tackle building sustainable communities. I hope that you're as excited as I am about exploring the fascinating world of sustainable development and its impact on urban environments. In today's session, we have the privilege of hosting a distinguished guest who brings a wealth of expertise and experience to the table. Joining us is Jonathan Manzo, the owner and principal of Urban, and a renowned design and consulting practice specializing in architecture, urban design, and infrastructure. Jonathan's firm has been at the forefront of transformative projects, setting new standards in design, community engagement, and resilience. At Urban, they have worked on a wide array of sectors, including the development and the deployment of utility infrastructure, urban regeneration, and brownfield redevelopment. Their impressive portfolio includes notable projects like the Hunters Point Vision Document, which outlines the remarkable transformation of a contaminated site into a vibrant new district along San Francisco's waterfront. They have also received recognition for their exceptional design work, with projects like Larkin Switchgear Building and the Potrero Substation receiving prestigious architectural awards. Jonathan's expertise lies not only in design, but also in fostering community and stakeholder engagement, a vital aspect of sustainable community development. By bridging the gap between architectural vision and the needs of local residents, his work has had a profound impact on the communities he has served. Today, we have the incredible opportunity to tap into Jonathan's wealth of knowledge and learn from his experiences. And we'll delve into topics such as community engagement, innovative design, strategies, and the integration of green infrastructure and the collaborative efforts required to create sustainable communities. So welcome, Jonathan.
Lenika, thank you for that very nice introduction. I'll try to live up to it, and I'm really happy to be here today. Thank you again.
Awesome. So super excited to have you here. So let's start out by introducing you and me and how we met and how we know each other and what you've been doing since.
Sure. So Lenika and I met at the UCLA Management Development for Entrepreneurs program back in 2018, 2019?
2018, yep.
Yep, and it was an incredible program run by UCLA, and I was given that opportunity through a scholarship from PG&E, one of the companies I've worked for. We spent about 3 months. We spent in classroom with a number of other entrepreneurs, and we actually developed a really great cohort of friends and thinkers. And since then, all of us, we went through the global pandemic.
Yep.
There was so it's been a bit of a roller coaster, but during the pandemic, I was lucky enough to remain fairly busy. I was continuing to do community outreach for one of the projects I was working on, and because of the nature of the lockdown, we moved that strategy to digital formats. So we did online surveys and postcards, mailings, Zoom meetings. And that was actually one of the kind of good learning moments from the pandemic, is that we can get into community engagement later, but one of the key aspects of community engagement, I find, is trying to meet people at how they can access. And the pandemic allowed us to kind of develop some other tools that gave people more access, like the online surveys, like SMS surveys, and some people preferred paper surveys. So
right.
And then since now that we've kind of returned to a fairly normal situation,
Sort of normal.
Yeah. I'm
pseudo normal.
I'm continuing to work on a few tracks in my business, including continuing the infrastructure work. consulting with other trying to get other utility partners, and then also looking to expand the design arm of my business.
Okay. So you've been busy, sounds like.
More or
You've
less.
been busy.
Trying to.
Yeah.
Busy,
Yeah.
been busy.
Okay. Okay, so I have some questions I want to ask you, but I really want to just kind of talk to you. One of the things that you brought up was in the community engagement piece was meeting people where they are.
Yep.
I just finished a program at Harvard. It's a sustainability leadership program. And one of the things that we talked about a lot in that program was psychological safety.
Mm-hmm.
And how when you're working on these projects, especially projects that that impact a lot of stakeholders, there are people, there are lots of different opinions and lots of different feelings, and sometimes the way that we're viewing a project is not the way someone else is viewing a project, and we have to account for that psychological safety, right? Because some people may be feeling threatened just psychologically. So how do you approach that when you're dealing with a stakeholder who maybe is just feeling a little threatened about the project?
So, I mean, let's kind of just like zoom out just a little bit and then think about
Okay.
how, you know, when infrastructure projects are built, they actually have a huge impact on communities. And, if you look back at the deployment of infrastructure, you can see multiple examples throughout our history where communities are impacted adversely, whether they're health benefits, access benefits, and more often than not, these are communities of color and disadvantaged communities. And I think one of the things that's happening now is that, now that we know this, it's incumbent on the utilities, the big actors, and the practitioners working to implement these to do better. So one of the kind of awakenings I had working on utility infrastructure over the last 15 years is trying to understand this lens. I can't, step in their shoes and understand this. But if you think about, there's one project I've worked on for many years. I started working on the Hunters Point power plant project in 2010. And that project was in the process of was in a remediation process. But that remediation process only started after many years of community advocacy to shut down the plant. So there was a lot of really kind of a lot like a long tradition of activism to kind of to remove this plant. So when I come in a few years later and I start talking about activating the site on an interim basis or redeveloping the site, there is a lot of trauma that is kind of coming to the forefront that I should have known about or should have understood better. But this is the type of thing you really need to be very careful to be able to listen to everyone's voice. And so to follow up on that, when I originally approached this outreach, it was really based on like I had a project. I wanted to get feedback about that project. And I think one of the things I've learned is that if you frame things in a transactional way where you want to have just a singular touch point, it's not really going to yield very beneficial feedback. There really needs to be a kind of sustained level of interaction with the community in order to get meaningful feedback. And this means kind of not showing up in just a transactional way. So how do we do that? It's pretty difficult because everything is project based, and you have the institutional partner who wants to they just want to implement the piece of infrastructure.
Right.
And I think it's a long process of kind of, rethinking the process. I mean, to their benefit, PG&E, did have one of the first environmental justice practitioners on their staff that kind of helped guide them through this. But I would say that you know, that is a good step, but we need to go further.
So do you live in San
I
Francisco
do.
or are
I
you?
do.
Oh, you do. Okay. Are you a native?
I am a native of Brooklyn, New York. So
Oh, okay. How
yeah,
long have you been in San Francisco?
been here for 20 years.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So you got best of both worlds. You got the East Coast and the West Coast. So you have it on lock. So let me ask you some of the key principles and strategies for developing sustainable communities that you guys at Urban that you employ. What are some of the key principles that you use?
Sure, sure. So, you know, over the course of the last, we wanted to create with the Hunters Point vision document. It was actually the product of many years of community engagement that started with the now Hunters Point program, which was designed and implemented by a firm called Envelope and a practitioner named Liz Ogbu. We worked with, I had developed the RFP and then I supervised that work. But okay, long story short is that the key elements of when we looked at the vision document, we basically wanted to create a community that was sustainable, that was accessible to all, that was kind of leading in energy practices. And when I mean, I'll expand on that a little bit in a second.
Okay.
And then also wanted to provide a kind of an equitable platform for people to access city services. So if we think of you know different neighborhoods around the city, we wanted to take this new community and make sure that it was providing the same, if not better, than the rest of the city. We also wanted the other major process, major thing that I've left out is um, development often means gentrification. So how do we make sure that the people that living in the community don't feel threatened by this new development and can perhaps participate in the new, or not perhaps, but can participate in the new life of the neighborhood. So instead of, this was a major issue among the community about working through issues of making sure that they weren't feeling displaced and making sure that the community was for them. So we tried to build into the vision document some protections that would, leverage existing programs that the city of San Francisco had in earlier eras about a kind of certificate of return to the neighborhood and a right to remain in the neighborhood. So we also looked at other kind of more novel approaches like creating a community land trust for the site. But at the time, the utility was not interested in that. But back to the kind of and if I'm not answering your question, let me know. But
No, it's fine. But I want to put a pin in it for a second because I want to go back to you talked about a certificate of return. So can you talk about that a little bit more? What's involved in the certificate of return?
So, and I'm recalling now from back, my memory might be fuzzy, but there was a time during an earlier iteration of the Bayview Hunters Point plan, part of the general plan with San Francisco, where when they were talking about displacement through gentrification, there was a certificate of return program where if you lived in the neighborhood, you were at the time of the redevelopment, you were able to kind of hold your place, and there was some sort of mechanism that would help you gain housing back in the neighborhood. One of the issues that San Francisco has has faced is that, if you look at the Bayview Hunters Point, it had traditionally been an African American neighborhood. It's actually the most diverse neighborhood in the city at the moment, but the African American population in San Francisco, and especially the Bayview, has declined over the last, like, between 2000 and now. So how do you what are some of the mechanisms to make sure that the people that traditionally lived there can live there and enjoy life there? Um,
I'm muted. I'm sorry, I'm muted. So I was talking and you couldn't hear me. So what do those conversations look like when you're bringing the community in and you're listening to them? How's that process work? How do you go about
so
setting up?
there's been a number of ways, and um, so I found that I've learned the hard way sometimes. Like, sometimes there are one of the issues about community engagement, and I'll go into, is that you often have a very motivated cohort of people that show up to every meeting, and
Mm-hmm.
that's because they're able to get there at a certain time, and they have
Right.
leisure time to be, not the leisure time, but the free time to be there. So sometimes you hear an agenda that is not exactly representative of the community. So I've had situations where we've done a lot of outreach, and then at the end of the process, we get other voices, and we're wondering why we missed those voices. And I think that it's still like kind of hard. It is definitely difficult to reach everyone. But as far as the conversations, the way I like to work is I like to start small and have first, gather, who is our cohort of people, who are we trying to reach, and then start with a small group of people and run a series of small conversations with people to kind of understand their needs. And then from those groups, also find out who are we missing from the conversation, and try to do outreach to them. The more kind of, usually there is a requirement to do a kind of bigger, pardon me, town hall type meeting. I don't really find that those, like the kind of meeting where someone's up on a lectern talking to people, I don't really find that those work terribly well, because it kind of sets up a weird um, dynamic where, there's a presentation, it ends, and then there's some conversation.
Mm-hmm.
There's it's kind of a controlled conversation.
Mm-hmm.
There is also a tendency to, unless these things are really kind of, these things can go off the rails as well.
Right.
People get very, you know, they're emotional about their neighborhood, and if they don't feel respected and informed, there is, a lot of these emotions come up in these meetings, and oftentimes it has to do, we're showing up with a specific project, but if you're working for a big entity that has done multiple projects over decades, you're showing up with your little project. People don't really distinguish you from them, and they're like,
Right.
yeah. It's
They're
like,
like, you're the same.
so what is, like, what are you going to do about this and this? I mean, for many years, we were working on a strategy to help redevelop the Hunters Point site, or to position it for redevelopment. That was working with the utility to move an existing piece of utility infrastructure off of the main site onto a smaller site, so it, like, free up the rest of the site for redevelopment. And
Right.
but people were supportive of the substation, but they wanted to talk about the
Mm-hmm.
redevelopment of the site. So
Right.
you have to kind of take the you have to take the feedback that you've heard from the community and give it back to the client, and hope that
Mm-hmm.
they really take this to heart. You know, it's very it's very difficult because you say like, here's the things that we learned and here's what you should do, and that sometimes is the can be frustrating because partners often have their own agenda. So
Right.
I also feel like that it's important for these communities have leaders in them.
Mhm.
uh, the decommissioning of the Hunters Point power plant wouldn't have happened without there was a coalition of mothers led by people like Espanola Jackson, Marie
Mhm.
Harrison, Tessie Esther. These people who really came together and advocated for the closure of the plant. And it's important that that we respect their leadership and make sure that they're brought into the conversation.
I love that, because one of the things that I've been talking about a lot, and I think when we were in the program, I had Trash Logic, but I hadn't launched Eco in the City. Eco in the City is really focused on bringing all the stakeholders to the table and making sure that everyone has a voice. And that's really what the work that we're doing. So that's why most of my questions are focused there, because I think that we may not always hear what we want to hear, right? Most of the time we don't hear what we want to hear, but we get perspectives that um, allows us to think about a project in a different way sometimes, and we're able to approach it from a different perspective, and most of the time have a much better outcome because now we have buy-in from
Right.
people because they've been part of the process. So I love that you're doing that. I wanted to ask you about the Larkin switchgear building
Sure.
uh, and Potrero substation. So they've received architecture awards. Congratulations.
You and
What what innovative design features or sustainable practices were incorporated into these projects?
So let me kind of frame both of the projects. So with both
Okay.
of these projects, I worked in a capacity what I would call design supervision, where I worked with the utility to develop the design brief, develop the RFP, and then choose the architect. And
Okay.
then during the process, I worked with the architect throughout the process of the different stages of design, and acting like as an advocate for the architect, and also as the kind of in between them and the client. So with the with both of these stations, I'll start with Larkin. Larkin was a small infill switchgear building in the Tenderloin, and one of the things we realized is that I really pushed the design team to think about how can we um, make this a kind of showcase of sustainability. One of the kind of cool things about this building is that it's mostly unmanned, so you don't have to condition it, meaning you don't have to put HVAC throughout the build to cool it, except for like maybe one or
Mhm.
two rooms. So we were able to say, it's not that hard to make this a net zero facility.
Wow.
So that is actually, in my understanding, the first net zero switchgear building in the country. And it's currently, what happens is that you design it to net zero, you put in all of the features, and then after 3 years, they assemble the data and then they certify it. So my understanding is that it's in the process of being certified right now. So the features we have in that building is that it's completely passively cooled. It has a solar array on the roof that runs the building load, the electrical demands of the building. So passive meaning that it's not, when we say net zero, sorry, not passive. When we say net zero, it's producing all of the energy that it needs to operate. And then also there was we created a green wall along the side of the building that fulfilled the stormwater drainage
Oh,
requirements.
wow.
So it is a pretty interesting. It worked out really well. I want to give a you know credit to TEF Architecture. and Paul Cooper and Justin Blinn, who ran that project. It turned out really well. The Potrero station is, on the other hand, is in the Dogpatch neighborhood of San Francisco. And one way that we framed that was, I looked at the neighborhood and I saw all of the different redevelopment projects going on. And I said to the utility is that we really don't want to build this for, if you go to Dogpatch now, it's still a lot of former warehouse buildings, but there's a lot of projects coming up and a lot of redevelopment. The Warriors Stadium is out there, UCSF, we have Pier 70, which is a redevelopment of former port property. And then you also have the former Potrero power plant that's being redeveloped by a company called American Barrel Company, and you have marquee projects by Norman Foster, Herzog and Demeron. We started our project actually before all of those started, but they were kind of in the planning stages. So I said to the utility, this is going to happen. We should build for the neighborhood that is going to be in 20 years. Let's not build for today. So we engaged with an architect named Stanley Sadowitz. He's a very well-known architect in San Francisco. The sustainability aspects of that building is that we put a green roof on that building. So that was, and then also we integrated a public plaza into that building. So eventually when the neighborhood comes to life, there is a plaza with seating. Not only it has a daytime condition. At nighttime, it's got a very interesting lighting pattern. So the idea is that let's try to fill, let's meet the project demands, what the goals are. Let's also show up in the urban context. So one thing that I've noticed just anecdotally, traditionally, these buildings are kind of mute. Utility buildings are mute to the public. They're kind of these long facades. There's really not much activity. My thought was like, if we activate it by putting some sort of public interface into it, it's going to be more embraced by the community. And it's also going to have, the community is going to, in some ways, take ownership of it. There's eyes on it, and there'll be less kind of, the uses that we don't want might not be there. I mean, if you look at like buildings, blocks that have no kind of life on them, that's often where uses that we don't want.
Right.
Or think about like when if you want to walk somewhere, it's much better to have a kind of series of things that you're walking by that are active instead of long stretches of emptiness.
Yeah.
There's
right.
Safety. So, we've actually integrated a kind of public plazas into the Potrero station, the Embarcadero station, which is downtown up in the Rincon Hill neighborhood, and then also the planned Hunters Point station.
So I have a question. I've been doing some of this research, I've noticed that there are more and more communities where they're taking spaces that were, heavily trafficked spaces and turning them into parks and more walkable spaces and bikeable areas. Are you seeing that a lot happening across the country?
Well, I think that you have this kind of this advent, kind of started in the pandemic, not the pandemic, but actually go back to a crisis before that, the recession. So during the recession, we had a lot of construction projects just kind of stop, and you had empty lots. And there was a lot of thinking about how do we program these empty lots to make them not a blight. So I think that there was a lot of, if you look at projects like, there's a project in San Francisco called Proxy. It's actually done by the same architect who did our now Hunters Point program envelope. where they took the Octavia Street Highway ramp had been removed. There were empty lots, and they worked with the city to kind of activate one of the empty lots that will eventually be public housing, and that not public housing, and that is something that has been activated for the last 10 years. So I think you have people looking, during the recession when there was not a lot of capital around, there was a lot of kind of tactical urbanism that said we can do something temporarily and see what this brings, and it'll act like as a test. So how can we activate a neighborhood with a small piece of property? So we have this happening with the project like Proxy. There was this whole parklet movement where in San Francisco and around the country, where you have people neighborhoods reclaiming part of the curb lane and creating like small little seating areas. Of course, we saw that happening during the pandemic when all the restaurants moved their seating outside. So I think there's been a kind of push for more access to the outdoors, especially during the pandemic, and public spaces for that, places that we didn't traditionally think of as places for potential public space. And I think a lot of that, and I know I'm getting a little long-winded, is that this kind of started through activism. There was somewhat of a retreat in the public sector from building new parks. But I think that this kind of activism and these urban like acupuncture moments really kind of created a catalyst for a creation of another set of public spaces. And now you see cities and around the country kind of developing standards for parklets, and also kind of understanding the importance of these kind of connector public spaces and communities.
Yeah, it's interesting. You speak about the pandemic and how, a lot of people were activated to kind of get out more and be outdoors. I have my personal experience is during the pandemic. We expanded during I have a trash company. So we expanded during the pandemic. And I had to go to the East Coast. And for me, and I was there for 3 years, but it started in 2020. Like it literally started in 2020 during the pandemic is when I went. And immediately I said, I need a community that is completely walkable. I don't want to have to drive everywhere. I don't want to deal with, just traffic and congestion. And especially because I'll be working from home most of the time, I want a walkable community. And I spent most of my searchable time on Google looking for areas and literally looking at Google Maps to see, where there were spaces where I saw a lot of green and where I saw a lot of shopping and restaurants. So I ended up moving into this neighborhood called Shirlington Village, where I lived in a building where we had a Harris Teeter grocery store on the first floor. And then the building was on top of that. And we had a CVS on the corner. We had a massage parlor. We had, we had the movie theater. We had 20 restaurants. Everything was right there. And so that was my personal experience. And I just became a different person during that time. For me, it was life-changing. And I think I drove my car in those 3 years. I probably drove my car 20 times in those 3 years that I was there. And I just love this, that's why I say greening our cities. I love the greening of our cities. I love how, how we're just starting to think in terms of, how do we create spaces that are sustainable, but also community building and community based, and give people spaces where they can walk and they can bike and they can do all these things outdoors. So
I grew up in Brooklyn, and my life was, I walked everywhere, and I lived in New York until I was about 33. And one of the great things is that you could walk almost everywhere or you could get on the subway and walk.
Yeah.
My siblings didn't get their driver's license. So, but I do think one of the things that's happened in our cities over the last 20 years or so, and maybe we're seeing a kind of reverse of that because it's not clear
Mhm.
what's happening post-pandemic in some cities. Some have
Mhm.
recovered well, others haven't. But in a place like Brooklyn, for example, it became super popular, and you have parks and you have access to you have outdoor space, restaurants, you can walk and get your groceries. The Again, it goes back to kind of, there's, maybe I haven't mentioned it yet, but equity. If you look at the Bayview Hunters Point, it only got a light rail maybe 20 years ago. So, of course, it was served by bus lines, but there's no grocery store, there's no big Safeway out there. There's no,
Yeah.
so there is a lens of equity around um, how do we create a baseline of walkable cities where it's not just accessible to those people who make an exorbitant amount of money. So this is part of a larger conversation, I think, about how to design our cities, design housing that it's no longer the cities are not just playgrounds. I mean, they're they're like, and
Right.
let's keep it you know let's keep one of the things that makes that I okay, a little bit of a tangent. So,
Mhm.
growing up in New York, we never really had like a mall or like even fast
Mhm.
food chains. And then
Yeah.
during the 90s, like a lot of like the big chain stores and all these other things came. And my feeling was always like, why do you want to go to New York to go to, I don't know, an Applebee's when you
Right.
when you can go to when you can go to that in any place? Let's so I guess I'm off on a
Yeah.
tangent. What I'm
No,
trying to
but that's the amazing thing about New York that I love is that you can
yeah,
get every kind of
yeah,
food and authentically,
yeah.
right? And not just the
Yes.
big box.
So how do we
Yeah.
create these kind of conditions where not only the if we have these big okay, so let's say we do a big redevelopment in the Bayview Hunters Point, and we have ground floor retail, and the ground floor retail is going to subsidize some community. We're going to increase the rent for these big ground floor retail, and
Hmm.
we're going to use that maybe some of the that those rents will be higher than other people's other smaller businesses, but who can afford those giant rents? It's usually the formula retails. People, I'm not saying there's anything against formula retail. We need to have a mix of businesses, but we also need to be aware of supporting people in the community and also kind of supporting entrepreneurship in the community.
Hmm. I think, yeah, to your point, and that's something that, even myself, and this is the work that I do, I don't always think in terms of that, right? I think in terms of what's convenient for me sometimes, right? I'm not always thinking in terms of, does this really make sense, for the entire community? And one of the things my son is dealing with right now, we moved back to California, and I wanted to be out where there was a lot more land, right? I told you things had changed for me. So I wanted I wanted more greenery, I wanted more land. So I moved out to Galt. I don't know if you know where Galt, California is, but I moved out to Galt. So it's like, way out here. We have no public transportation.
Where is Gulf?
So
What county?
Galt is out near Lodi. We're in,
Okay.
yeah. So, it's mostly agricultural out here. But we have no bus lines. We have no public transportation. My son went to high school in DC because we were in DC, for the last few years. He didn't get his driver's license because everything was walkable.
Right.
So we're here now. And so to your point, he's kind of in this kind of stuck state. If I wasn't here, right? If I wasn't able to kind of drive him around, how would he get anywhere? And because I travel so much, he's usually just stuck at home, right? So how do other people who, maybe don't have the support that my son has,
Yep.
who live outside of where there's public
Yep.
transportation and, there's good infrastructure, how do they thrive? How do they get equity in their lives? I
Yep.
think to your point. Yeah.
No, I mean, you don't have to go very far out of cities to get
Mm-hmm.
places that don't have very adequate transportation.
Right.
And, just from a kind of, the further you get from cities into rural areas, and, I'm generalizing now. So, maybe your viewers will push back on this, but access to things kind of, access to healthcare, access
Mm-hmm.
to resources, they all become dependent on transportation. You also might not have, you'll have a regional healthcare or you'll have a small town healthcare facility, and then you might be an hour away from like a, more top flight medical care. So all of this is a challenge, especially to people without access to cars or people that have begun to age out of driving. These are areas where largely our local governments have kind of, I would definitely encourage you to bring on some transportation planners to kind of counter this, but we don't really see the same type of innovation in this sector. I guess one of the things that possibly there is a kind of movement of micro mobility and also autonomous vehicles. One thinks that, okay, this might be a great area where rural communities could really be served well, instead of if there was some sort of fleet, like a regional based fleet that could service people like that, people that need on-demand transportation. But I mean, have you ever tried to get a taxi in a small town? So
We literally have no taxis. There's no, and if you want, I mean, we can call an Uber, we can call a Lyft, which is expensive, right? To go, it's over $100 for us to go to the airport in a Lyft or an Uber.
yeah.
Um, you know, but there's just no real infrastructure. We do have like a shuttle that takes you to the next town over, which is like Elk Grove. But that's it. And then
Like, your point of this, I think, is interesting because, much of our focus has been on cities.
mhm.
These are kind of sexy, and they have, you know, they've had this resurgence over the last 20 or 30 years, and it's actually pushed people further and further out. If you look at communities, people commuting back in, I mean, now telework has kind of reversed that. But we need to start, as kind of practitioners, we need to start thinking about how do we create equity in those communities as well? How do we bring the resources that, I hate to think of like the cities as kind of the playground for very rich people or just tourists. It seems really kind of, it's not how I grew up. And I really hope that we kind of, urban policy begins to think of, you know, this kind of city country divide a little bit more thoughtfully. Clearly, people who live out in rural areas have their reasons for doing so. Um, you know,
Yeah.
some of the kind of you know, misgivings anecdotally that I've heard is they don't like being told, they don't like policies that are dictated by the city being pushed on them. Um, but I do think that if there was kind of a more equitable access to resources, some of these issues might be less. Some of the kind of political divide issues might be a little bit less harsh.
Yeah, I think depending on where you are in your life, I think that determines also why you make decisions about where you live. Um, you know, when I was younger, my children were very small. We lived in Arizona, and we did move to a rural community that was just, you know, starting to be developed. Now it's pretty, you know, it's pretty thriving. It's Queen Creek, Arizona. But back then there were, you know, there was nothing there. We had one Safeway and a Circle K. Um, and we moved out there because that was what we could afford, right? We had small children, and you know, to kind of to what we were speaking of earlier, there was less infrastructure, so it was cheaper to live out there than to live in Scottsdale where we worked, right? So I remember my husband at the time used to say, we have more time than we have money, so we're just going to commute, you know. So we'll just, you know, we'll commute. You know, but that was early 2000s. And that was, you know, those were economic decisions. As you get older, you start making different decisions. And some of those decisions have to do with, sometimes it's economic, but sometimes it's lifestyle. You know, I just, like I said, I wanted more space. I wanted more green around me. So for me, it was more, I wanted to create an environment that I felt like I could have peace in, you know, as
Right.
because my life is so busy. But I didn't take into account how that would affect my teenage son. Like I was thinking how I wanted to feel.
Yeah.
Not once did I think how he was going to be impacted by living way out here, you know, where
Yeah.
there's all retired people around us,
I think that
you
like
know.
it's kind of back to this idea of like what is the baseline platform that we want to provide, like our country wants to provide to
Mm-hmm.
people to kind of facilitate their lives. And
Mm-hmm.
can we can we agree on a kind of, you know, a baseline that is not like, you know, if you think about, I don't know, school districts, the idea that you go from one school district, which is got amazing facilities, to another one that's got, you know, horrible facilities. And
Mm-hmm.
how is this, you know, is there a way to kind of think of what we are, the kind of social contract that we're setting up with our citizens? You know, there's this whole idea of rugged individualism, and everyone, you know, you're an entrepreneur, you're doing things on your, you know, you're making things happen. But let's think about where you start from, right?
Right.
Like, is it, if you're running a 400-meter race and someone's starting at 300 meters and you're starting at 100 or at
Yeah.
zero, is
Yeah.
that, so how can we kind of make this uh you know, and these are the levers of government and policy that I don't really have much to do
Mm-hmm.
with, but I do think that by changing the way we build in our cities, you know, if we create better communities, you know, kind of, if we create walkable communities, if we create communities that are even to the issue of decarbonization, you know, and this is another tangent, if you think about um, you know, look at where all the solar panels are in California. They're probably not in the Central Valley, and there's a reason for that. Central Valley probably needs more solar, but they don't have the resources to put it on their homes. You know, the government is providing a lot of incentives in the Infrastructure Act or the Inflation Reduction Act, but in the decarbonization piece, it's often communities, disadvantaged communities that get left behind. So back to the main point is like, what is the platform? What is the baseline that we're creating for people? And, and then back to infrastructure. If we're going to, infrastructure is vital to the function of society. Let's not um, let's not burden one community over another with these facilities. And when we do cite them, we work with the community to mitigate these impacts, and we make it so we kind of change the conversation from a piece of something that is hated in the community to something that is embraced.
No, I absolutely agree. And I'm really happy we're having this conversation because I didn't want this conversation to be just static where I'm just asking you questions. I really wanted it to be free flowing. So I'm really happy that you're sharing, really your heart here. You're not just, giving us talking points. You're really speaking from your heart. So one of the things in your experience, what kinds of, how do you approach your clients with some of the things that we're talking about? How do you bring that into the conversation and make sure that they understand some of these equity issues?
Well, I mean, to be honest, it's a kind of long conversation.
Mhm.
One of the things that I've kind of, at the beginning of the work that I did with the utility company, I was able to, I started the conversation with the external affairs, public affairs departments, and they had a kind of direct line to the executive suite in the company, and they were able to sell a lot of these ideas. The issue kind of comes where it breaks down is that this has to kind of occur at multiple levels in a company. It can't just, they can set an agenda at the top, but they also have to empower people who are doing it to, and when they, meaning empower, that they fund it and they make it part of policy. So it doesn't feel like an add-on at the end. So ideally what I've tried to do is I say, let's look at your portfolio of projects 5 years out, and let's identify like where those are occurring and what are the issues that concern the communities that you're working in. Some communities are going to require more attention, some less, some baseline, but let's have a baseline approach. So
Right.
a lot of this has been one of the things that we've kind of tried to, the benefits of this approach is that, let's say, back to kind of my former career, I used to work in film production, and we used to show up on a site like if we were filming on location, we would show up and film for, a day, a week. But by the time we showed up, we had spent months planning. We had talked to everyone on that street. We had talked to every business. We knew what time they opened. We knew if someone was moving. So we had it all kind of dialed in. When we showed,
Yeah.
we couldn't plan for everything. There's always like an X factor, but we knew if there's major road work happening. So my kind of approach has been like, for a construction project as well, let's understand what's happening in this community. Let's not show up and all of a sudden, you know, people are outraged because they're surprised and they don't know what they're doing. So the idea is that we're kind of planning for this, and we're understanding the problems in advance, so we don't have a project shut down by a protest, or like, like there's an issue of local hire is a big issue. People in communities throughout all across the country, they want jobs. How do they get access to these construction jobs, and like how do they get access to jobs that are not just a gesture, not just a token. How can we build
Mhm.
capacity, right? So part of the the things the utility did on several of their projects is they implemented a local hire program where they hired 35% of the workforce from the local community, and they were actually they were not just kind of um, they started at an entry level, but there was capacity to kind of grow along the way. So how do we
Mhm.
kind of so there's the issue of telling the utility the project's going to go smoother, the community is going to be happier, the city is going to be happier, and in turn, you know, the relations with the city are going to be better. So the idea is that we're trying to hit some of the issues that they're concerned about. Primarily, they're concerned about budget, scope, and schedule. So we're saying, okay, let's add community engagement. Let's add, an element of design excellence, and let's add sustainability. Eventually, you're going to be forced to do these sustainable measures. Let's be
Mhm.
let's be proactive and show some leadership here.
Yeah, let's do it now. So before we leave, I want to I want to put this out there because I'm working on a number of construction projects now for in multifamily
Yep.
spaces. And one of my pet peeves, call it what you want, is that these projects bring me in at the lease up stage,
Oh yeah.
and the building is already framed out and built.
Yep.
So at this point, you're asking me where you should put the trash.
Right.
We have egress issues. We have, we have space constraints. There's nowhere for us to stage bins. Like there's
Yep.
so many problems at this point that we're trying to work around. So I'm just saying, just bring in your waste consultants early when you're building these projects.
I empathize with your thing, like your issue, because like they've come to me and they say, how can we fix this problem? I'm like, well, we're 3 years into it, so
Yeah,
let's kind of the idea is to think about this beforehand, uh,
yeah,
not try to kind of shoehorn.
retrofit.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's gonna cause more problems at the later date. I mean, I think one of the kind of mentalities that I think that's hard to break is there is kind of this short-term thinking and kind of culture of crisis in a way. Like we have a problem, we just need to fix it. Instead
mhm.
of, I mean, in a perfect world, all of this gets planned in advance. You
Yes.
know, we do need to be nimble and help them find solutions
Mhm.
in the moment.
Mhm.
Um, and hopefully there's a kind of the thing that gets me more is actually that every project has to be reinventing the wheel. Like
Yes.
it's like, we can help you if we think about it.
Right.
Yeah.
We think about it in the beginning, and I always say that it actually costs you more now because now we have to add more labor in order for this to work, right? Because we can't just put a 4-yard bin in here. It's not going to fit. So now I have to put toters in here. Now we have to hire people to pull these toters out, individually every day. I mean, it's just going to cost you more money, more
Yep.
time, more effort. So if we just handle this in the beginning, specifically in Oakland, that drives me insane in Oakland because, their waste program in Oakland is so stringent and there's so many rules. You can't just do what you want to do. So you have to think about these things, in advance, because after the fact, it's too late. We're almost stuck with just manually doing everything. if we didn't do it right in the beginning.
The
So,
other thing I would say is that there might be an opportunity to kind of, and I don't know who this would be, but to kind of get in on the kind of code level, like trying, because the state, there's the International Building Code and then there's the California Building Code. But talking to people about consulting in the development of code, I was at an event last week called Build Out in LA, and there was a woman speaking about her concrete polishing company, and she was talking about how she is one of the people who helps develop the code for
oh,
concrete.
wow.
So
Okay.
so there is they are taking people's expertise into
Okay.
account. So I think that, if there's a coalition of people in the same space, you could also start to kind of put, these things take multiple
Time.
take time.
Yeah. Yes. I get it. So, but thank you so much, Jonathan. This has been a great conversation. How do you feel?
I feel great. Thank you. I mean, it's great to connect with you again.
Sounds good. Have a great day, Jonathan. Happy
Take care.
Saturday.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.